As alluded to in previous segments of the lecture, it wasn't long before you see this development of anti Chinese sentiment, which would evolve into anti Chinese politics in the US West. And this was driven in large part by nativism, okay, as indicated here. And nativism is basically anti immigration social movements, right? They're still around today. Certainly, they're around back then in the 19th century. At the very least, nativists advocate uh, some sort of immigration restriction, if not altogether exclusion of foreigners into the country. Now, in the context of the 19th century US, nativism was really the belief that the Anglo Saxon race, in particular, right, Anglos, were the true quote unquote natives of the United States. Never mind that there's Native Americans, right, as in Indians, as they're known back then. Um, but they believed they were the true natives, the Anglo Saxon race, and therefore they wanted to maintain the racial homogeneity of America as being Anglo Saxon. Okay, I did mention a while back that even in the mid 19th century, the Irish were not considered white. Okay, so they're not in favor of Irish immigration, the nativists. In fact, there's going to be a political party that arises in the 1850s called the Know Nothing Party that will be anti-immigration, specifically anti-Irish. Right? Interesting to note that. But in any case, returning to Asian American history, as I mentioned, at first the Chinese were looked at favorably by the industrialists and capitalists. They surprised um, their bosses, their employers, by completing this railroad work, very hard work. But I also mentioned that you see more and more American laborers arriving to the West in California. They're arriving from the East and they're there to seek work. And therefore, you see competition among the workers grow by this time in the 1860s, 1870s. So, with the competition that was wrought with the presence of Chinese workers, and you couple that with pre existing Orientalist stereotypes that I just referred to, that is the Chinese as being inferior and a depraved race, totally un-American, right, and incapable of assimilation. You add that together with economics, um, and also they're misconceived as coolie slaves, to use our earlier term, right? That they're actually not the free worker, but the slave worker. So you see white laborers and white unions galvanized into action. They're uniting in force to oppose a Chinese presence in the West. And this is, again, the formation of anti-Chinese movement. And it became known as the so-called Chinese question. This is the political question that arose regarding the Chinese and their presence in the West. And you see law after law being passed in the attempt to restrict and eventually exclude the Chinese from immigrating to the United States. Um, and when you look at these laws, they actually start from the beginning. Actually, they start from the 1850s before the punctuated protests, political protests that erupt after the Civil War. But here are some examples of anti Chinese legislation. As I said, even from virtually the beginning of Chinese presence, you see something called the foreign miners tax that was imposed upon the Chinese. And let's remember, they're there because of mining, the gold rush. So this tax was required of all miners who were not U.S. citizens to buy a license for a monthly fee. It was a $3 fee every month, and it would increase with each successive year by $2. Now, though the Chinese are not mentioned, it says foreign rather than Chinese. This foreign miners tax, the one passed in 1852, would specifically be aimed at the Chinese. By the way, what's astonishing about the foreign miners tax is the amount that the Chinese paid. They paid millions of dollars cumulatively through the years for the state revenue here. But it's well known, it's in the historical record that the collectors of the miners' tax often harass the Chinese. In fact, there's incidents of torture and even murder committed against non-compliant Chinese. A common practice that I recall just now was to take the Chinese miners who were trying to get away with the tax, right, or were perceived as trying to get away. They would tie the Chinese miners together by their queues. Now, the queue is that long braid in the back. And by the way, that long braid is not a cultural practice held by ethnic Chinese. They're known as the Han Chinese, H-A-N. That's the ethnic Chinese. Rather, it was imposed upon the Chinese in China by the Qing Empire, the Qing Emperor himself, and it's mandated that all Han Chinese wear this queue as a sign of allegiance to the emperor. Let's remember the Qing Empire was a foreign empire that came down and basically dominated China. Now, the next item listed here is a case called the People versus Hall. And basically, the story behind this is that the California Supreme Court arrived at the determination that the Chinese could not testify against American citizens in court. And you can see the ramifications of this, hopefully. This means that if there are any crimes committed or various injustices perpetrated against the Chinese in the United States West, well, the Chinese were virtually powerless. They couldn't use the court of law to address these crimes or grievances committed against them. So again, this adds to the powerlessness of the Chinese in the U.S. The next one is the Page Act, or the Page Law, that was enacted in 1870. And basically, this banned the immigration of most Chinese women to the United States. The exemption to this was Chinese merchant wives. But behind this law was this tint of moralism here. That is to say that, as I mentioned previously, yes, there was a small fraction of Chinese women coming to the U.S. West. You had the wives of the merchant class, but you also had some Chinese prostitutes coming over. And again, this caused the legislators in the West to ban Chinese women in general. But the pretext of the law, so to say, was to stop Chinese prostitution, quote, immoral women, unquote, was the way they termed it. So you could also see the ramifications of this. If no Chinese women are allowed in the West, this prevents family formation and even a definitive community, right? Community formation of Chinese Americans. You can't see families form, and therefore you don't see the children of American-born children, that is, of the Chinese immigrants taking advantage of the 14th Amendment. Okay, now, what is that, the 14th Amendment, if you don't already know it? Well, this was passed at the end of the Civil War, where you see the radical Republicans of the Senate, they basically confer citizenship upon the freed slaves. So the Civil War ends in 1865. By 1868, 69, you see this debate, and then you see the ratification of the 14th Amendment, right? And it's stated in this way, that people who are born on U.S. soil are automatically conferred citizenship rights, right? So this is a way of giving or providing citizenship to all the freed slaves. There's nearly 4 million slaves, former slaves that is, who are now provided with citizenship since they're born in the United States. Okay, so this could obviously apply to other groups, however, namely immigrants who now have children born. So, one way of not providing citizenship to Chinese children, right, the children born in the United States, was indeed um, by denying them the 14th Amendment rights. Okay, so if you don't have family, again, then this is not going to happen. You're going to preclude that possibility, and indeed, the Page Law works in that favor. All right. This is followed by, as I mentioned, the backdrop of anti-Chinese agitation. It gets picked up as a political issue because at first, you see anti-Chinese sentiment um, demonstrated by the working class, especially that are coming over to the West, as I mentioned, and the Working Man's Party, actually, and that was on the previous slide. Okay, it was led by Dennis Kearney, and here it is right here. And basically, this was anti-Chinese because of not only the negative stereotypes associated with the Chinese, but also because of the economic competition. So, Dennis Kearney and the Working Man's Party was a significant institution in basically the successful purge of the Chinese from the American West. Here's a quote from Kearney. Let me just find it here. Well, he says here, quote, "The Chinese laborer is a curse to our land. He is degrading to our morals. He is a menace to our liberties and should be restricted and forever abolished. The Chinese must go." Okay, so you even see that here in these. The Chinese must go here in this slide, and it says it here, the Chinese must go. Interestingly, this slide here is a common way of framing political issues in propaganda, and that is to say, the use of womenhood, right? Women, American women specifically, as being somehow threatened, right? American women as being threatened by foreign elements. Okay, and here it's the Chinese, and then you're going to see it later, World War One. The Germans, the Huns, so to speak, as being a threat to, American womanhood. Certainly during the Cold War propaganda, you'll see that too. That's to say, the Russians, the Soviet Union, as a threat to American womanhood. But here it's depicted plainly, right? Women as being, in peril. So you see racist violence break out because of this anti-Chinese agitation. You see it picked up as a political issue. In other words, you see politicians latching onto this because they know that they won't get elected unless they endorse this anti-Chinese movement, right? In fact, there are famous politicians in the West and leaders even that latch onto this issue. One is Leland Stanford, who, as you may know, is the namesake of Stanford University. Okay, very influential person back then. So the cumulative effect of all this anti-Chinese legislation is for it to move from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. That is to say, the president, his name was President Chester Arthur, he agrees to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, let me move back to this slide. And here it is right here, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this law is unique in that it stands out as the first and only immigration act to specifically designate an ethnic, racial, or nationality group for exclusion from the U.S. And basically, this act served to exclude all Chinese laborers, whether skilled or unskilled, from entering the U.S. for a period of 10 years. Okay, so that's the Chinese Exclusion Act. And you can imagine what's going to happen after that, right? No more Chinese laborers coming over. If you did come over, you had to have identification certificates issued by the Chinese government, and you had to have these early forms of a green card, really, to show to proper officials in the United States that you were, quote, legal. All right, now a provision added, to the 1882 Exclusion Act is something called aliens ineligible for citizenship. All right, now this directly links to the 14th Amendment I just mentioned. Basically, it's saying this, that the Chinese, whether they're coming to the United States as immigrants or even those born, if there happens to be born, if there happens to be American-born children, well, they are denied citizenship rights no matter what. Another way to say this is that they're perpetually aliens or perpetual foreigners. Okay, they're always going to be foreigners to the United States. Now, you may ask, what was the justification or the rationality behind this provision, basically pronouncing all Chinese and later all Asians, okay, as being ineligible for citizenship, even though there's the 14th Amendment? Why does the 14th Amendment, or why doesn't it apply to Asians? Well, it's because, going back to Orientalism, it was felt that persons of Asian descent were basically unable to assimilate to American culture, American society, the American worldview, American political, social, and economic life. So therefore, they cannot be citizens. All right, and again, the underlying ideology for that way of thinking is Orientalism. All right. Okay, so this is going to have seismic effects upon Chinese immigration, needless to say. Some other acts that are anti-Chinese was the Scott Act. And basically, you had Chinese during the 1882 Exclusion Act that were, going back to China, and visiting family, especially saying that you can't re-enter. If you have to be in China with the passage of the 1882 Exclusion Act, you are prohibited from entering or re-entering the United States after your temporary departure. So basically left, thousands of Chinese stranded and unable to come back. And then you had the Geary Act. This is really the last nail in the coffin, so to speak. It's basically saying this, that, as I mentioned, the 1882 Exclusion Act had a lifespan of 10 years. So every 10 years hence, let's say 1892, Congress would decide to extend it for another 10 years. And that's what the Geary Act did. It extended Chinese exclusion for another 10 years. And then by 1902, Congress made Chinese exclusion permanent. So there you go. It's now permanent. And by the way, the Chinese Exclusion Act would not be overturned until 1943. And if you know anything about the 1940s, this is when the United States and most of the world were embroiled in World War II. And as it happened, China and the United States were allies. And therefore, we felt obligated, we were prompted to nullify the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Because they're our allies. Okay, we'll now move to the last slide of Chinese immigration, but it's not the last slide of this theme, because we still have to talk about the Japanese coming over who are going to follow the Chinese due to exclusion.